It's good to look out at the crowd tonight and see people who have come through so much with me and who so graciously accepted me into the fold of the movement in this district. A Latin teacher who had really never done much in politics outside of vote. And so many of you, when I talked to you about having a mustard seed, because after Donald Trump won, it was hard for us to find any faith at all in our fellow citizens and our ability to affect change. But we talked all the way back then about how to find faith in a little part of yourself. Even if some days you don't believe a lot, that any day we can always find a little bit of faith, a mustard seed of faith, that what we do today, that moral actions bear fruit in the long term. The faith of Martin Luther King, the faith of the women's movement that achieved the right to vote without having the right to vote. That kind of faith is what has been propelling this movement since last year, since Marissa Pyle bravely stood up at the last, perhaps ever, real town hall that Doug Collins has or will ever hold. I don't know if any of y'all were there that day, but Marissa Pyle smuggled in a piece of paper which had been forbidden from that town hall by Doug Collins, who apparently is a big fan of safe spaces. And she unfurled this paper that she hid in her cane, and it said, "Doug Collins tried to kill me," which is true, because he had voted for the removal of the ACA without a replacement and without protections for pre-existing conditions. And when she was let out by security for holding up a piece of paper in front of our snowflake congressman, I thought, I can't sit here after she has been let out. So I stand up and raise my fist, and half of the whole room empties out in front of our representative. And since that time, he has not shown his face in a town hall in the entire 9th district. And I am so excited about bringing that resistance and that fire to our debate tomorrow night. Doug Collins is going to walk out of that radio station and he's going to know that he had to work for a living for 1 hour out of the year. I came to talk to you tonight about something that's very urgent. Long ago, you've probably all heard the metaphor of the canary in the mine. Long ago, they used to use these poor little canaries to try to determine whether a mine was safe for miners to go into, because you can't detect the carbon monoxide that can build up in those mines. And so they would see whether or not the canary lived, because the canary was small. It couldn't handle very much carbon monoxide. And so they could easily detect, without risk to themselves, how safe that mine was. Fast forward a century, and I believe that we are seeing canaries in the mine. And unfortunately, for our country, those canaries are now people. And also, unfortunately, those that are in power do not sense the real risk they are putting our world in. We have learned over the past couple of weeks that we have 12 years to radically change our energy economy, the technology by which we build and move and live. In response to this dire warning, President Trump's EPA released a study that said in 50 years, global temperatures are going to rise so drastically that life as we know it, civilization as we know it, will be impossible. Therefore, why worry? We're going to actually relax emission standards on cars. That's a real report that was put out. We have an urgent situation on our hands. And we know the statistics. You can look at numbers. And liberals and Democrats are good with numbers. We know this. Under Democratic presidents, deficits fall. Under Republican presidents, they rise. President Trump, one of the few things he has accomplished that is bigger and better than any other president in the history of the world has been deficit growth. However, Democrats have not been so good always at communicating the human story and the human reality of these impending dangers. The numbers tell us this: it was twice as expensive this year to pay for natural disaster cleanup than it was last year. And it's only going to get worse as the world grows hotter and wetter. We must act boldly. The numbers tell us that the carbon levels in the atmosphere are rising. And because some countries are developing that weren't developed before, there's even more carbon being released. And it's growing quicker and quicker. Some of the frozen tundra that has held in so much methane for so long is now melting, releasing all that methane into the atmosphere. And that's one of the worst and most dangerous forms of greenhouse gases out there. The Democrats have put out a plan on their website, A Better Deal. And one of the most important plans under the Better Deal is a $1 billion investment into infrastructure. And if you send me to Congress, I will guarantee to ensure that that infrastructure is green infrastructure. Investment in technology that saves greenhouse emissions from cars, investment in high-speed rails that will get people safely and in a friendly way to the environment from home to work, that will open up new portals to employment that they did not experience before. Imagine a high-speed rail in a corridor like Atlanta. We spend so much money on traffic and working on the roads that we could save by having a high-speed rail that could get people from rural communities without a lot of job opportunities into Atlanta, where there's always a growing job opportunity. That's one of the guarantees that I make going in. But how in the world do we communicate this message of urgency to our neighbors? Because one of the things that we've really lost in our country, that perhaps people in my community hadn't realized before. You know, a lot of African Americans, LGBTQ, Native Americans, other oppressed groups have told people like me who have become more alarmed, welcome to the club. It's been this way for a while. We've been living in the middle of collapse for a long time. And I only wish that the progressive movement in the 80s, that the Democratic Party in the 80s had listened to people in oppressed minority neighborhoods suffering from a crack epidemic, the same way they're listening to white opioid victims today. If you look at the arc of history, oppressed people are the canary in the mine. They don't tell you about a limited truth, a limited reality that's going to stay in their community. They are telling you about the future. The future is already real for them. And that future is coming to your doorstep unless we hear their voice and empathize with their suffering. Beyond science, we've got to build a better, deeper, more thoughtful politics around compassion and cooperation. We must stop blaming the victims of our crimes and our injustices and start listening to their voice. Not out of charity, but because they are our equals, and because what they are experiencing today will come home to roost with us tomorrow if we don't stem the tide. The African American community, unfortunately, has had so many of these disasters happen in their neighborhoods, from the war on drugs that has put more people in prison in this country than the entire prison population around the world. We have more prisoners in this country than Russia has, or even than China, with such a much larger population than we have. When it comes to punishment and violence, we carry a blank check in this country. But compassion pinches pennies. We have got to change our priorities. One thing that I think that we need to talk about is the fact that green energy is not a threat to jobs. We must begin to talk about how green energy creates stable local jobs for today and for our grandchildren. That investment in technology is not a threat to people who work in fossil fuels in Texas and Florida and Louisiana. It is actually turning away from fossil fuels is the best way to prevent more of these natural disasters from happening to those very areas where they work. Economists have also pointed out that the long-term costs of these storms that are growing more and more extreme within the next 2 or 3 decades will outweigh all of the economic benefit that we have derived from fossil fuels over the past few decades. An incredible amount of devastation. I can't communicate to you enough how dire this situation is, but I'll tell you who can. Talk to people in Puerto Rico. You want to know what the opioid epidemic would look like from the prophetic voice of the past? Look at African American communities who suffered from the crack epidemic. Back then, African American men mostly worked in industrialized urban settings. Then they became deindustrialized. People sought alternative economies because guess what? Human beings are economic creatures. And crack was the only thing left to them. That was a prophetic moment in American history that we did not understand. We did not understand because we didn't look at it through the eyes of compassion. Today, the opioid epidemic is ravaging the Southeast and Appalachia, where we used to have industrialized centers in rural areas. And the same thing that was happening to people with black skin back then that we didn't care about, suddenly it's happening to people with white skin. And I hope we begin to treat it before it's too late. If you wonder who the canary in the mine for today is, it's people who live in Puerto Rico. That is the economy, the energy infrastructure of the future. That is the politics of the future, unless we change course. Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and it caused untold devastation. We had 200,000 refugees from an American territory. Refugees. The first refugees, by the way, from America that I've ever heard of came after Trump was elected. We had refugees fleeing America for fear of the Trump regime. And then we had refugees from Puerto Rico. And wouldn't it be beautiful poetic justice if those American citizens, 200,000 of them, who moved from Puerto Rico to Florida, can upset the apple cart of this spineless, godless GOP? Hurricane Maria and the awful devastation it's caused, combined with the cruel neglect of our government, is the canary in the mine for our environment. That is coming. That's the future already in Puerto Rico. The future is here, and it's scary. We have got to work with compassion and cooperation to prevent it from happening to other communities and to help the community in Puerto Rico heal. Because let me tell you, if the GOP is still in charge when that thing starts to hit South Carolina, or maybe it hits a blue state, the GOP will neglect it just like they did Maria. And then, of course, they will continue their tactics of lying and concealing the disaster. Not even counting the deaths. Not even counting the dead. One of the most basic acts of humanity. Even elephants honor their dead. But humanity seems to not be able to do so. I pledge to boldly stand up for a turn away from fossil fuels that is endangering every community and, in fact, an entire human civilization across this planet as we know it. We must invest boldly in technology that will save our planet. There will never, under my watch, be a solar spill that you'll have to worry about. Or a wind explosion. We will not have to invade countries to export sun and wind, because we have plenty of it right here at home. But I will tell you who will be threatened by this. There are people whose power depend on fossil fuel. We subsidize them richly, and I actually think that those people should be the ones who pay for the future development of green technology. We need to tax fossil fuels and make them pay for a safer future, a safer energy economy. That's my pledge to you. And I want to close on this. One of the hardest things about being a liberal sometimes, or being on the left, is that we have compassion. That's actually both a bug and a feature of being a progressive. We have hearts of flesh and blood, and when we see victims like those in Puerto Rico suffering from injustice, we feel their pain with them. And often we are criticized for doing that. You know, you worry about these people down in Puerto Rico. You're just a bleeding heart liberal. That's all you are. You're worried about the children down the street who aren't getting enough food. What a bleeding heart. Well, I want to say this tonight, and I want to say it proudly. I do have a bleeding heart of flesh and blood. And I'm going to wear it right here on my sleeve for everybody to see, for all oppressed groups in this country. Because I believe that what makes us human makes us equal. And the suffering of one person in this country from injustice that we create is the suffering that all of humanity must face and confront and resolve. But even though I do have a heart of flesh, I'm like a lot of other people in here. I have a brow of steel. And I'm going to stand up to Donald Trump and Representative Collins and all of the people who have bought their loyalty over the past decades and corrupted our Congress. I will bring you a Congress with a mind and a heart and a soul, ready to work for the least of these. If you want to know where I get my politics from, take a look at some of FDR's old speeches, Martin Luther King's speeches, and the Sermon on the Mount. I'm inspired by people who live every day in this country beyond the headlines. People who are still recovering, communities who are rebuilding without help in Puerto Rico. African American communities who have suffered so much oppression over the years and who still manage to stay intact. And I'll tell you who I've learned from a lot this past couple of weeks, and I'll close on this. The LGBTQ community. Pride Parade was a deeply spiritual event for me because I saw people who for so long have been told something's wrong with you. You need to hide what you feel and who you are. They were showing who they were to the world. And something as harmless as a bikini photo or a swimsuit photo that families take all the time, for them, in their communities, especially rural communities, can be a real threat to their livelihood. There are refugees in this country from homes who will not accept their LGBTQ sons and daughters. And I was so inspired because I talked to them about how they cope with oppression. They said, well, it's simple. We cooperate. We have a list of people, a call list. Here's a list of phone numbers of people who can come pick you up on a moment's notice. We keep a list of people who you can stay with short term. And here's another list of people you can stay with long term. That spirit of the recognition of human value is where we need to go as a country. These people who are suffering are our signposts. They are not mere victims. They are our heroes. And that's who I will continue to look for inspiration. Thank you for coming out tonight. I look forward to hearing your questions.